lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord Almighty. For my soul longs and even faints for you. For here my heart is satisfied within your presence. I sing beneath the shadow of your wings. Better is one day in your courts, better is one day in your house, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts, better is one day in your house, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. One thing I ask, and I would seek to see your beauty, to find you in the place your glory dwells. One thing I ask, and I would seek to see your beauty, to find you in the place your glory dwells. Better is one day in your courts, better is one day in your house, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts, better is one day in your house, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. My heart and flesh cry out for you, the living God. Your spirit's water to my soul. I've tasted and I've seen. Come once again to me, and I will draw near to you. I will draw near to you. Better is one day in your courts, better is one day in your house, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts, better is one day in your house, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts, better is one day in your house, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. My heart and flesh cry out for you, the living God. Your spirit's water to my soul. And I've tasted and I've seen. Come once again to me, and I will draw near to you. I will draw near to you. Better is one day in your courts, better is one day in your house, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. Better is one day in your courts, better is one day in your house, better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere, than thousands elsewhere. step down into darkness. Open my eyes, let me see beauty that made this heart adore you. Hope of a life spent with you. Here I am to worship. Here I am to bow down. Here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. King of all days, oh so highly exalted, glorious in heaven above. Humbly you came to the earth you created, all for love's sake became poor. And here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. And I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon that cross. I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon that cross. And I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon that cross. Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. Yes, Jesus. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart the hour I first believed. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior has ransomed me, and like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace. Lord, we worship you, Lord, for the grace, that amazing grace. Yes, Jesus. The Lord has promised good to me. His word, my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior has ransomed me, and like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace. Sing it out. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior has ransomed me, and like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace. The earth shall soon dissolve like snow. The sun forbear to shine, but God who called me here below will be forever mine, will be forever mine. You are forever mine. We fall down, we lay our crowns at the feet of Jesus. The greatness of your mercy and love at the feet of Jesus. We cry, holy, holy, holy. We cry, holy, holy, holy. We cry, holy, holy, holy is the Lamb. We fall down.
Genesis chapter 21, and we're going to read verse 8 to begin. Not the only verse, but this is what we're going to start with, and we're going to talk about what makes this story so meaningful. Genesis 21, verse 8, it says, "And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned." So we're talking about Abraham's son Isaac, who's been born after 25 years of waiting, which we talked about that last week. Now, as Americans, if we talk about a baby being weaned from nursing, typically, most of us would think, 6 months, a year, maybe on the outside 18 months. It's rare that it goes beyond that in our society. But if you were to go back and live in that part of the world in that time of history, what you would have found is that in the ancient Near East, mothers back then typically weaned their children when they were about 2 or 3 years of age. And the reason I mention that is not just so you'll know how old Isaac was at this point, but it's more important that you won't know how old Ishmael, his older brother, was. Ishmael, if Isaac was 2 or 3 years old, then Ishmael would have been 16 or 17. Why? Because the Bible tells us Abraham was 86 years old when Ishmael was born, and he was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So we're talking about a period of 14 years difference, and then if Isaac was 2 or 3, you add that, and so it tells you Ishmael, at the time of this story, is somewhere around 16, maybe 17 years old. And that's going to become important because later on we're going to see that the Bible describes Ishmael by using the word boy or child. And when you read that word, he's just a boy or a child, you assume a little kid. You don't assume somebody like Andrew, for example. You think of as someone maybe 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 at the outside. And so they assume that Ishmael was a young child when this story happens. But the Hebrew word that's translated boy, it's kind of like a very broad word. It could mean literally a small child, a boy, but it can be used all the way up to a teenager or even a young man, just depending on the context. And it was just one of those words that was pretty flexible, and people had to know what was being talked about, who was being talked about in terms of how old this boy was. And so before we get into the details of the story, I want you to understand this. When Ishmael does what he does, he wasn't just some little kid being silly and playful. He was 16 or 17. And he knew what he was doing. So the question is, what was he doing? Well, let's read verse 9. It says, "But Sarah," so that's Isaac's mom, "saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian," that's Ishmael. "She saw him whom she had borne to Abraham." What's he doing? He's laughing. So again, you read that and you're like, well, that's nothing wrong with that. Why wouldn't a kid laugh, even if he is 16 years old? Well, again, it's not just some kid having a good time at a party that his father is throwing. The Hebrew word plays a role here. This word has 2 possible meanings. Number one, it can mean just to laugh, like somebody tells a joke, ha ha, we all laugh, and we'd use that word. But it has a secondary meaning, again, depending on the context, and it can mean to mock someone. So there's a difference between laughing at something someone does because they're trying to be funny, or laughing at someone because you're trying to make fun of them. And apparently that's what Ishmael, who's again 16, 17 years old, he's doing to his little brother. And Sarah could tell that this was what was happening, that Ishmael was mocking Isaac, and she becomes angry. Well, there's a couple of other translations of the Bible that actually bring this out. Let me just read them to you so you see that I'm not making this up. So you're all familiar with the NIV Bible, very popular. Here's how it translates Genesis 21, verse 9. It says, "But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was," not laughing, but what? Mocking. So it brings that idea out. And then the New American Standard, a very, very good, accurate translation. Here's how it says, "Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking Isaac." Now, in the original Hebrew, Isaac isn't in there. But because of the way the grammar is set up, it's implied. And so the New American Standard actually adds his name. This is what he was doing. He's mocking his younger brother. So kind of keep that in the back of your head, because we're going to come back to it, and you'll see why it's important. And then there's one more thing I want to bring out before we get into the rest of the story, which is that legally, Ishmael is Abraham's oldest son. meaning he's his primary heir. And we've studied this in other teachings, especially in the Old Testament world. If you had a father and he had more than one son, when the father died, his estate would pass on to the sons, but it was never divided equally. The oldest son always received the double portion inheritance, right? You've read that in the Bible, you've seen it, which means Ishmael would have received 2/3 of Abraham's estate, and Isaac would have received 1/3. And so now, with all of this background, the word laughing, what he's doing, how old he is, and this idea of the inheritance, you're kind of beginning to understand why Sarah, Isaac's mother, is getting so upset. I'm not saying she's right to do this. I'm saying you understand it. You understand what's going on in her head. First of all, she's angry that Ishmael is mocking his younger brother, her son Isaac, and it's really, he's tormenting him in an effort to provoke him. This is not lighthearted teasing. Mocking is a much more serious thing. He's trying to really, really antagonize Isaac. And secondly, she's thinking about the fact that someday Ishmael, who's not her son, is going to get twice as much as her son of Abraham's wealth. And this is just building up in her. She's watching what's going on, and suddenly it explodes and it all comes out, and she goes to Abraham and makes a demand of him. Let's read it in verse 10. So she, talking about Sarah, she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son." That means what it says. Make her leave. She's not going to live in this home anymore where we are. Cast her out. Why? For the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. I don't want her getting a portion of your estate, of your wealth. I want Isaac to be the only one who has this. And so here's Abraham. Here's his wife making this demand. She's really, really angry, and he's caught in a difficult situation. Verse 11, and the thing was very displeasing to Abraham, and it tells you why. On account of his son. So that shows you Abraham loved his son. He loved Ishmael. He knew Ishmael wasn't perfect. He knew there were some problems there in the relationship, but he loved his son, and Abraham knew Ishmael was old enough now. He was capable, and if he sent him away, Ishmael was of age. He could have survived. He could have made a living for himself. And yet the thought of sending him away, even at that age, grieved Abraham. Says he was displeased on account of his son. He's not happy. And it brings me back to a basic spiritual principle that we've seen several times coming out in the stories of Abraham's life, and it's that sin always leads to consequences that we never intended, right? Sin, it always leads to suffering, and it always separates us not just from God, but in many cases it separates us from other people. So think of the story of Abraham and what he's going through. 16 years earlier, he and Sarah, Sarah started and he agreed with her. They came up with this idea to have a son through Hagar, Sarah's maid. But to do so, they had to step outside of God's plan. And they're trying to bring about the fulfillment of a promise that God had made, but they're doing it in a way that makes sense to them. God never told them to do that. So in a sense, Abraham was, not in a sense, in a literal sense, Abraham was disobeying God. God never said, you go take Hagar as your wife and have a child through her. Abraham just did this. And now, all these years later, the consequences of what he had done were coming back on him, and it's leading to heartache, because now what? His family is dividing. He can't stop it from happening. And if he listens to Sarah, he's going to lose his oldest son probably forever. Ishmael's going to leave, and he's probably not going to see him again. Abraham knows that. But again, it brings you back to that idea, this principle of unintended consequences. Whenever we step outside of God's will, whenever we do something that God didn't tell us to do, it's an act of disobedience, and eventually we're going to have to face the reality of what that produces. There's a famous verse in the book of Galatians. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7, which many of you can quote by heart. Here's what it says. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. And then it goes on and tells you how this works. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. In other words, what you do, what I do, it's going to come back to us. There's always going to be a harvest, whether we sow to good and righteousness and reap a reward of righteousness, or we sow in disobedience. There's not a reward, there's a recompense. It's really a sad story here. If you have any kind of imagination, you can put yourself in the situation of each of these people. You can imagine what Abraham must have been feeling, right? Some of you have been in something like that. You can imagine what Sarah was feeling, Hagar, Ishmael. It doesn't take a whole lot to figure out what kind of emotions were being stirred inside of them, what kind of mental turmoil they were going through. And each of these people, they were paying a very high price for something Abraham did 16 plus years earlier. Now, here's what we do whenever we fall into sin. We don't stop, at least I don't. We don't stop and think, if I do this, what's it going to do to me? Right? I don't stop and consider that. If I make this foolish choice, what's going to happen a month from now, a year from now, whatever, right? I just do it because I put it out of my mind, or because we believe that God's grace is real, and it is. We think, it's going to be all right. God loves me, and he doesn't want his children to suffer. And if I do this, God will make everything work out, and there won't be any serious consequences. So either we don't deal with it, or we just kind of push it to the side and say, well, God will take care of me. Here's the problem. God does love us. That's true. There's no arguing that. However, what you want to remember is that God is holy. And God is holy enough that he cannot just overlook our sin. Let me show you a really well-known part of a verse in the book of Habakkuk, chapter 1. It's the first part of verse 13, describes God's character. Here's what it says. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. That's God. And so I'm rebelling against him, and I'm doing what I want to do, and I'm not going to be told any different. God is not going to tolerate that in me. God won't just ignore my sin and act as if it doesn't matter. In fact, the opposite is true. One more verse. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13. And no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. I'm going to answer to God for the things that I do. Even when I want to think, well, God will just ignore it. It doesn't work that way. Here's the point I'm trying to drive across. And I'm not a doom and gloom preacher, and I don't hang anybody over hell in my sermons. But there are times when you come across a story in the scriptures where you need to deal with these things. Sin is serious. God takes sin very seriously. And my sin will lead to consequences that I never intended and that I do not want to have happen. And in all honesty, Cheryl and I have been in the ministry for so many years now that I've lost track of the number of times either I've sat down with someone, she's sat down with someone, or we've done it together, and we just talked to somebody whose life has been devastated by some kind of sinful act, whether it was theirs or what somebody else did to them. And we've been there trying to help them deal with the pain and the agony that sin has caused. And it's a terrible thing. It really is a painful thing to be there. And whether it's you dealing with somebody else's pain or in your own life, something that sin has done to you, and now you're reaping the consequences. And I'm very, very happy. I'm very, very grateful that this part of Abraham's story doesn't end there, because I've run across it too many times. People get derailed by something that happens, and they never do get back on track with God. But that's not what happens to Abraham. Because even when you're guilty of serious sin, and now you're struggling because of what you did, the truth is God knows how to make a way forward. I want you to understand this. I want you to hear this. God knows how to make a way forward for you, and he knows how to restore you to the place where you can experience his blessings again. That's the truth. Now, I am not saying that God will undo the consequences of your sin, right? But what you have to remember, God knows how to make a way so that you can move forward in him and not be trapped by the consequences of past failures. So let's talk about how this worked in Abraham's case. God didn't undo everything that resulted from Abraham's sin. Hagar and Ishmael still had to leave his home, and he wouldn't be able to raise his son. And that relationship was coming to an end. But at the same time, God gave him Abraham a promise. He said, even though Ishmael is going to leave, God says, I'm going to take care of him. Look at Genesis 21, verse 12. God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Watch verse 13. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. He's your son. And that was God's mercy to Abraham and to Hagar and to Ishmael. Abraham had sinned. There's no denying it. And now all three of them were suffering. But because God is a God of mercy, he gave them a way forward. But it didn't take away the immediacy of the pain. And I can't even imagine what Abraham must have felt like the next morning. Look at verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took a bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And as far as we can tell from the Bible, and I looked it up to make sure I wasn't wrong about this, that's the last time we know that Abraham saw Ishmael. Ishmael's name does not appear in the Bible again until several years later when he meets up with Isaac, his half-brother, to bury their father Abraham, who's died. So again, we don't see God undoing the consequences of Abraham's sin. The reality is Abraham did something that wasn't God's plan, and he suffered, Hagar suffered, and Ishmael suffered. But what we do see is God's mercy. And I want to use a term here that Abraham wouldn't have been familiar with this term, but you and I will understand it. God made a way for a dysfunctional family to move forward. If I'd have used that phrase with Abraham, he'd have been, what are you? That wasn't language of the Old Testament. But we all understand what it's like to be part of maybe a dysfunctional family, a dysfunctional workplace, a dysfunctional individual existence, right? We all have these relationships or things that are in our lives that are not functioning as God wants. Because of sin, because of hurt, because of pain. And yet God offers us a way, while he doesn't necessarily undo everything we've done and that we've been through, he offers us a way forward into his blessing. And then there's one more point I want to make from this story. And it sounds kind of negative, but I need to say it because it's important. God's provision in times of distress, where he brings us through and brings us to the place of blessing, that provision doesn't extend to everyone. It is limited to those who are in relationship with him. And the reason I say that isn't because I'm making it up. It's in the Bible, Genesis 21. Let's look at verse 13 one more time. Watch this. God says, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also. Why? Because he, Ishmael, is your Abraham's. He is your offspring. He's your son. Here's the point. Abraham was in a covenant with God. We studied that several months ago. There was an unbreakable relationship there. And Ishmael, as the son of Abraham, is now indirectly through Abraham part of that same covenant. And that's why God provided for Ishmael. That's why God showed him mercy. And here's why it's important to us. Because there are a lot of people in the world, including people in the church world, that treat God as this generous cosmic Santa Claus that's just sitting up there waiting for us to ask him for whatever it is we need. Just snap our fingers and here it's going to come. But they don't really have a relationship with him. They're not serving him. They're not following him. They're not in any way part of his kingdom, except in the most peripheral way. And they simply think God is going to take care of their needs. That's not how it works. I'm not saying God can't. I'm saying if you want God's blessing, then you need to have that relationship. And that's one of the reasons you've heard me say the same thing over and over again in one form or another, just about every week. No matter what's happening in your life, no matter if things are falling apart, no matter how you're struggling, remember one thing. You need to keep Jesus at the center of your life. You need to build everything around Jesus. All the other things you have, which are so important, you can't discount them, you can't throw them away necessarily. But Jesus must be your foundation. And that's what's going to bring you into the things that he has for you. So, you can find yourself in a situation just like Abraham, right? Maybe not exactly the same, but something similar where you're looking at your circumstances and you're saying, man, there's no way out of this. I mean, Abraham, I think he would have said that, right? I'm going to lose my son. I can't imagine if that was my story. There's no way out. And when you find yourself in a really bad situation, if you're like me, and I shouldn't have these thoughts, but I do, you can come up with a million ways to walk away from God. Pastors have those thoughts, not just you. I have those thoughts. Why should I serve God? Why shouldn't I, right? How am I going to get out of this? Here's the truth. In that really bad situation Abraham found himself, if he would have walked away from God, here's what would have happened. His already bad situation would have only become worse. But because Abraham chose to follow what God said to him, God provided a way for him to be blessed in spite of what he had done. So first of all, Abraham is able to raise his son Isaac, who becomes one of the patriarchs of Israel. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And God also takes care of Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness. They're about to die, and God provides and he gives them a future. We won't read that entire story for the sake of time, but let me read verses 20 and 21 of Genesis 21. It says, and God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So God even takes care of Ishmael, who is in some ways, not nearly as guilty as Abraham. God shows him grace and mercy. This is one of those stories. There's a lot of negatives here. And probably we could all look to our lives or the lives of people we know and care about, and we could see a lot of parallels. Bad choices, terrible decisions, sinful selfishness, all of these things coming out. In this story, as far as the negative aspects, there's not really a good guy. There's not a hero in this story. There's a lot of blame to go around. I mean, you think of Abraham and Sarah. All those years earlier, they had basically forced Hagar to have a child with Abraham. She wasn't given a choice. This is what you're going to do. And now she's in the situation. So Abraham and Sarah have got blame to share. And then Ishmael. Maybe he's not as guilty, but the Bible clearly says he's old enough to know better, and yet he's tormenting this little brother of his with the intention of just making him really angry and upsetting him. And he knows he shouldn't do that, and yet he's doing it foolishly. And then Sarah. I understand what it is to get angry. So do you, right? We've all been angry at someone. But Sarah demands that Hagar and Ishmael, because she's angry at them, be thrown out into the wilderness knowing that they're probably going to die. Sarah's not the good guy in this story either. All of these people are behaving selfishly, sinfully, and in every case it's making the situation worse. But in the middle of the story, God visits Abraham. God says, do what Sarah says, and I'm going to take care of it. And Abraham probably didn't understand how, probably didn't understand everything going on, but he trusted God enough to say, I will do what you say. And because Abraham obeyed God, God provided for their needs. And listen, God worked everything out according to Abraham's plan, according to God's plan. Let me leave you with this. And then we're going to go and have a water baptism. But it's important that you hear this. When you are in serious trouble, and in an honest assessment, you could say, yeah, I did this to myself. I got myself in this situation. Listen, as long as you have breath to breathe, as long as you have a mind that thinks, as long as you're able to utter even a word or two, it is never too late to turn to God. Our God is merciful. Our God is gracious and kind. And you may have dug yourself the worst hole imaginable. Or maybe you're like Ishmael. You kind of did some of it to yourself, but somebody else has done it to you, and you're just caught. You don't know what to do. God is not inaccessible. God is listening, and he's just wanting you to come to him. Doesn't mean he's going to fix it the way you want him to, but God has a plan. And because he's God, he knows how to take the impossible and change it into a blessing. It may take a lot longer than you're hoping, and it may happen in ways you never saw coming, but God is faithful, God is powerful, and God is loving. So don't stop seeking him. Don't stop praying. Don't stop reaching out to him. Don't pull away from other Christians. Don't pull away from the word. We could go down the list of things, right? But you know what I'm talking about. Keep a hold of God. Don't let go, because God will work it out if you'll stay faithful long enough to see it happen. That's the God we serve, and he's able to do what he has promised.